for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host today. We'll have updates regarding the Israeli-Hamas war that's going on. We have an update to the General Motors strike. The tentative contract has been voted upon, and it's a little bit closer than maybe the UAW bosses wanted it to be. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Also, new rules would make it easier for millions of Americans to unionize. Unfortunately, businesses are pushing back. Not a big surprise there. The House voted to prevent a government shutdown. Oh, speaking of the unions, we have a Hammer Time segment, and I'm going to give it to you straight up. Markwayne Mullin, who's won this award before, is going to get it again this week for what he did earlier in the week in Congress during a hearing. This is unbelievable stuff. I told you, Republicans are evil, violent, conservative traitors. You'll have the proof in just a little bit. Before we get started with today's topics, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on X, the former Twitter, at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, Tumblr, YouTube, and Mastodon accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and WMTB St. Petersburg, Florida. So be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. If they're not carrying us, give them a call, send them an email, and just ask them to please pick up Southpaws. We would greatly appreciate that. We are recording this show on Wednesday, November 15th, 2023. For the state of Michigan, it is the opening day of firearm deer hunting season, so expect about 500,000 hunters out in the woods trying to bag a buck or doe. Right now, let's get to the Associated Press. They've been covering the Israeli-Hamas war. Here are the latest updates. 2.5 weeks after sending tanks and ground troops into northern Gaza, Israeli forces entered a hospital early Wednesday that they claim Hamas operates out of. Mohammed Zakut, the director of hospitals in Gaza, said Israeli tanks were inside the medical compound and that soldiers had entered buildings, including the emergency and surgery departments, which house intensive care units. Shifa Hospital has become a symbol of the widespread suffering of Palestinian civilians during the war between Israel and Hamas, which erupted after the militant group killed some 1,200 people and seized about 240 captives in a surprise October 7th attack into southern Israel. The Israeli army claims the militant group uses hospitals as cover for its fighters and has set up its main command center in and beneath Shifa Hospital, the largest in the besieged territory. Both Hamas and Shifa Hospital staff deny the Israeli allegations. More than 11,200 Palestinians, two-thirds of them women and minors, have been killed since the war began, according to the health ministry in Hamas-run Gaza, which does not differentiate between civilian and militant deaths. About 2,700 people have been reported missing. So here's the latest. From Cairo, Egypt, around 40 patients a day are coming in to Ottawa Hospital in the Jabalia area of northern Gaza. That's according to the hospital's manager. Ottawa Hospital is still operating, but the facility's main generator is no longer functioning, according to the hospital manager, Dr. Ahmed Mahana. The hospital is also delivering about 20 babies each day. In a recorded message, he said, quote, "The situation is critical," end of quote. Jabalia has been heavily bombed since October 7th. Mahana said that Israel strikes were still pounding the areas immediately around the hospital, with shrapnel striking the building. 8 staff members have been injured from the bombing. Out of Zikim, Israel, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told troops at the Zikim military base near North Gaza, quote, "There is no place in Gaza that Israel will not reach," end of quote. Standing next to the soldiers at the base, Netanyahu said, quote, "Do you remember when we were told that we would not break into Gaza? We broke through. We were told that we would not reach the outskirts of Gaza City. We arrived. We were told that we won't enter Shifa. We entered. There is no hiding, no shelter, no refuge for the murderers of Hamas. We will arrive and eliminate Hamas and return our abductees. These are 2 sacred missions," end of quote. From Ankara, Turkey, Turkey's health minister says 26 patients from Gaza and 13 people accompanying them have passed through the Rafah crossing into Egypt on Wednesday. Speaking to reporters in Egypt, Fahrettin Koka said Turkish officials hope to evacuate the patients and the people escorting them to Turkey by air later on Wednesday for treatment in Turkish hospitals. Koka also said that Turkey plans to set up a field hospital close to the Rafah crossing. Turkey has long offered to treat cancer patients in the country. Koka described the patients evacuated Wednesday as Gazans and did not specify if any have Turkish nationality. Meanwhile, out of Geneva, Switzerland, Iran's foreign minister has traveled to Geneva for a previously undisclosed meeting hosted by a leading humanitarian group that works to strike peace agreements. Hossein Amirabdollahian spoke with the UN's top humanitarian aid official, Martin Griffiths, in a meeting at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which made headlines 5 years ago for its role in an accord in which the Basque separatist group ETA agreed to dissolve after a decades-long campaign in Spain. The center said in a message sent to the Associated Press Wednesday that it, quote, routinely convenes closed-door consultations to support conflict mediation and resolution in various parts of the world. In the latest of these consultations, HD hosted a senior Iranian delegation and other invited guests for a discussion about Gaza focused on ways to alleviate human suffering, increase humanitarian assistance, and reduce risk of escalation in the region, end of quote. The center's website said it has been working on conflicts around the world and, quote, brings all parties together to find the path to peace, end of quote. The Israeli ambassador in Geneva, Myron Ilan Shahar, said, quote, Israel expresses its indignation that the foreign minister of Iran is in Geneva and meeting with UN officials and NGOs to talk about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, end of quote. As she posted this on X, the former Twitter, quote, Iran has no place in the future of Gaza. It is part of the problem, not the solution, end of quote. Iran's foreign ministry said in a statement on X that, quote, as part of his consultations in Geneva, Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amirabdollahian has met with a number of officials in the UN, humanitarian organizations, and religious institutions, as well as university professors and some ambassadors there regarding the ongoing developments in Palestine and the Zionist regime's aggression against Gaza, end of quote. Back to Cairo, the head of the UNRWA, the UN Relief Agency for Palestinian Refugees, confirmed Wednesday that it has received 23,000 liters, or about 6,000 gallons of fuel, that crossed into Gaza via the Rafah crossing, but called for more to be allowed to enter the besieged territory. The aid group says Israeli authorities allowed the fuel to enter under the restriction that it can only be used to transport aid into besieged Gaza. In an online statement, Philippe Lazzarini said, quote, this fuel cannot be used for the overall humanitarian response, including for medical and water facilities or the work of the UNRWA, end of quote. The UNRWA needs 42,200 gallons of fuel each day to complete, quote, basic humanitarian operations, end of quote. Israel declared war on Hamas and barred fuel shipments after its attack on Israel on October 7th, saying the group would divert the supplies for military use. Coordination of government activities in the territories, the Israeli defense body responsible for Palestinian affairs, announced early Wednesday that it would allow United Nations trucks to refill at the Rafah crossing on Wednesday. It said the decision was in response to a request from the United States. Also from Cairo, a senior official with Gaza's Hamas-controlled health ministry says Israeli forces are still operating inside Shifa Hospital hours after launching a raid early Wednesday. Speaking by phone from the hospital, Munir al-Bursh said Israeli soldiers ransacked the basement and other buildings, including those housing the emergency and surgery departments. He said, quote, they are still here. Patients, women, and children are terrified, end of quote. He said doctors vowed to stay with their patients, quote, till the end, end of quote. Israel says Hamas has a secret command center in and under the hospital, but has provided no visual evidence. Hamas and the hospital staff deny the allegations. The military said it was carrying out a precise and targeted operation against Hamas in a specific part of the hospital away from patients and medical staff. It said it also delivered medical supplies. Well, you got one party saying one thing, one party saying another. I'm going to believe the Palestinians. I'm sorry, I don't believe the Israeli government. I don't believe any of the governments. Sorry. Al-Borsh called for the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross to secure a safe corridor for patients, medical staff, and displaced families trapped in the facility to leave. He said an Israeli official spoke with him by phone early Wednesday and asked him to join the forces searching the facility, but he refused. So there you go. Out of Jerusalem, the main Palestinian communications company warned Wednesday that Gaza will plunge into a communications blackout in a matter of hours following several short-term outages in recent weeks. In a post on X, the former Twitter, Paul Tell said dwindling fuel supplies have forced all of its generators in Gaza to shut down and that communications in the territory are now dependent on batteries. The company warned of a, quote, cessation of all communication services during the next few hours, end of quote. Israel allowed the first shipment of fuel to enter the besieged territory on Wednesday, but the UN said the amount allowed in is not enough to aid the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation. Going back to Geneva, the UN's top emergency relief official on Wednesday condemned reported Israeli military raids on Gaza's embattled Shifa hospital and insisted Hamas militants must not use it as a shield for their activities. Martin Griffiths underscored growing international concern for the plight of patients in the Gaza City hospital who are too sick or frail to be moved. In a video statement, he said, quote, look, Hamas should not use a place like a hospital as a shield for their presence. Hospitals should not become a place of a war zone of danger, end of quote. Griffiths earlier said on X, the former Twitter, that he was appalled by overnight reports of Israeli raids on Shifa. The World Health Organization says Shifa patients have needs that are well beyond basic care. Images reportedly from the facility show medics trying to keep newborns warm in blankets because power for incubators had failed. Griffiths said, quote, the babies have no incubators. Some are dead already. We can't move them out. It's too dangerous. I understand the Israelis' concern for trying to find the leadership of Hamas. That's not our problem. Our problem is protecting the people of Gaza from what's being visited upon them, end of quote. From Copenhagen, Denmark, Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store said Wednesday that he was very happy that the first Norwegian citizens have arrived on the Egyptian side of the border with Gaza. Norway had been informed that 51 Norwegians could leave Gaza via the border crossing at Rafah. Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide said, quote, there are no safe places in Gaza and everyone who is there is exposed to traumatic experiences, end of quote. Continued that the situation in Gaza was, quote, a humanitarian disaster which also affects Norwegian citizens. The acts of war must stop and humanitarian aid must be allowed in, end of quote. According to the Norwegian news agency NTB, there are about 270 people with ties to Norway in Gaza, with approximately half of them being children. Going back to Ankara, Turkey, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan increased his criticism of Israel on Wednesday, calling it a terrorist state intent on destroying Gaza along with all of its residents. In a fiery speech to members of his party, Erdogan also said his country should take steps to ensure that Israel's political and military leaders are brought to trial in international courts. Erdogan said, quote, Israel is implementing a strategy of total destruction of a city and its people. I say openly that Israel is a terrorist state, end of quote. Erdogan described Hamas militants as resistance fighters trying to protect their lands and people. Turkey recently normalized relations with Israel, but its war with Hamas in Gaza has again strained their ties. Israel recalled its diplomats from Turkey last month after Erdogan accused Israel of committing war crimes. Turkey later also recalled its ambassador from Israel. From Tel Aviv, Israel's military insisted Wednesday that its forces in and around the largest hospital in Gaza are specifically targeting Hamas, which it claims set up a command center there. Both Hamas and Shifa hospital staff deny the Israeli allegations, and we've mentioned that a couple of times now. From Khan Yunis, Gaza Strip, a rainbow appeared in the sky over southern Gaza on Wednesday as residents, many of them refugees from the northern part of the Strip, struggled for survival amid round-the-clock airstrikes. Residents in cars and on bicycles and makeshift carts pulled by donkeys weaved their way through the city's roads, littered with rubble from the bombardment. Egyptian Mohammed al-Abdallah has been trying to leave Gaza since the bombing started. He said, quote, they asked us to come from the north, and when we arrived, we stayed in an apartment here, and we were bombed. Do they want us to die? This is enough, end of quote. Well, I'd say the answer is yes. That's essentially where we're at with Israel, is they want to wipe all Palestinians off of the map. They really do, folks. And it should be considered a war crime. I'm sorry, I'm not a fan of genocide regardless of who's doing it. Oh, but Israel... No. I don't care they were victims of a genocide 70, 80 years ago. You don't turn around and then become the manipulators of a genocide. That's not right. Also from Jerusalem, requests for gun permits in Israel have skyrocketed since Hamas's bloody October 7th incursion. That is according to a press release from the Ministry of National Security. The statement said that more than 236,000 new requests for permits have been filed since the attack, a figure equal to the number filed over 20 years. A sense of insecurity gripped Israel following the attack and the army's hours-long delay in responding, leading to a rush to buy guns. At least 1,200 people were killed, over 240 taken hostage after Hamas militants breached Israel's border fence and fanned out across the country south. Armed civilian security squads entered the breach in the army's absence to fight off some of the attackers. Shortly after, Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir said he would expand and arm such squads with 10,000 assault rifles that would be distributed particularly in border towns, mixed Jewish-Arab cities, and West Bank settlements. Ben-Gvir has a long record of anti-Arab rhetoric, and Palestinians feared those guns would be used against them. And why wouldn't they? Some 1,700 permits are being issued daily after the Ministry of National Security eased restrictions, according to the report. By comparison, an average of 94 were issued daily in November 2022 and an average of 42 a year earlier. Also from Jerusalem, the United Nations Children's Agency says its top official visited the Gaza Strip early Wednesday and met with children and their families in the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis in the south of the territory. UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell said in a statement to the Associated Press, quote, what I saw and heard was devastating. They have endured repeated bombardment, loss, and displacement. Inside the Strip, there is nowhere safe for Gaza's 1 million children to turn. End of quote. Russell is among the few international officials to have visited the Gaza Strip since the war began following the surprise attack by Hamas on October 7th. In the statement, she called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and for aid to be allowed unrestricted, saying that, quote, in the hospital's neonatal ward, tiny babies were clinging to life in incubators as doctors worried how they could keep the machines running without fuel, end of quote. She also met UNICEF staff and their families. Over 100 UN staff have been killed in the Gaza Strip since Israel launched a war aimed at destroying Hamas, which the UN should be filing charges. Really, they should. So there's the latest on what's happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip. Let's go to an update on labor. This is Tom Krischer writing for the Associated Press out of Detroit. This is dated November 15th. Voting on a tentative contract agreement between General Motors and the United Auto Workers Union that ended a 6-week strike against the company appears too close to call after the latest tallies at several GM factories were announced Wednesday. The union hasn't posted final vote totals yet, but workers at 5 factories who finished voting in the past few days have turned down the 4-year and 8-month deal by fairly large margins. However, a factory in Arlington, Texas, with about 5,000 workers, voted more than 60% to approve the deal in tallies announced Wednesday. The vote tracker on the UAW's website shows the deal winning by 686 votes. But those totals do not include votes from GM assembly plants in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Wentzville, Missouri, the Lansing Delta Township and Lansing Grand River plants in Michigan, and a powertrain plant in Toledo, Ohio, which all voted against the agreement, according to local union officials. In most cases, the vote tallies ranged from 55 to around 60% against the contract. But in Arlington, production workers voted 60.4% in favor. Nearly 65% of skilled trade workers approved the deal, making the tally tight. Spokesman for both the union and General Motors declined comment while the voting continues. It wasn't clear what would happen next, but local union officials don't expect an immediate walkout if the contract is voted down. Voting continues at Ford, where the deal is passing with 66.1% voting in favor so far, with only a few large factories still counting. The contract was passed overwhelmingly in early voting at Jeep maker Stellantis. The union's vote tracker shows that 79.7% voted in favor, with many large factories yet to finish. Local union officials say longtime GM workers are unhappy that they didn't get larger pay raises like newer workers, and they wanted a larger pension increase. Newer hires wanted a defined benefit pension plan instead of the 401k defined contribution plan that they now receive. Tony Toddy, president of the union local at the Toledo powertrain plant, said the environment is right to seek more from the company. He said, quote, "We need to take advantage of the moment. Who knows what the next environment will be for national agreements? The company never has a problem telling us we need to take concessions in bad economic times. Why should we not get the best economic agreement in good economic times?" End of quote. Thousands of UAW members joined picket lines in targeted strikes against Detroit automakers over a 6-week stretch before tentative deals were reached late last month. Rather than striking at one company, the union targeted individual plants at all 3 automakers. At its peak last month, about 46,000 of the union's 146,000 workers at the Detroit companies were walking picket lines. So the contract might end up getting voted down. This could be very interesting, and we will follow that over the next week or two, possibly even further along if the contract is indeed voted down by rank and file. Speaking of more good news for the unions, let's get to our next story. This is Deanne Durbin writing for the Associated Press. This is dated November 13th. A new federal rule that goes into effect next month can make it easier for millions of workers to form unions at big companies like McDonald's, but it's already facing significant pushback from businesses and some members of Congress. The rule, announced late last month by the National Labor Relations Board, sets new standards for determining when 2 companies should be considered joint employers under the National Labor Relations Act. It sounds wonky, but essentially the rule could widen the number of companies that must participate in labor negotiations alongside their franchisees or independent contractors. For example, it might require Burger King to bargain with workers even though most of its U.S. restaurants are owned by franchisees. Or it could require Amazon to negotiate with delivery drivers who are employed by independent contractors. Kathy Creighton, director of the Buffalo Code Lab at Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations, said, quote, "It's trying to take in the realities of today's workforce when many employers subcontract out work and say, oh, we're not the employer. It's the employer who is really calling the shots and has the money," end of quote. The NLRB says the new rule changes a 2020 rule that made it too easy for joint employers to avoid their responsibility to negotiate with workers. The 88-year-old National Labor Relations Act guarantees the right of U.S. workers to form or join unions. But critics say the new rule is an overreach by the labor-friendly Biden administration that undermines independent business owners. Some, including the American Hotel and Lodging Association, have already sued to block it. During a recent conference call with investors, McDonald's president and CEO Chris Kempczynski said, quote, "The franchise business model is a really great American innovation. It's created wealth for thousands, particularly underrepresented minorities and women. This is something we think needs to be supported, not attacked," end of quote. U.S. Senators Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia, and Bill Cassidy, Republican of Louisiana, have introduced a Congressional Review Act resolution that would overturn the rule. Of course he would. Cassidy's a conservative, and Manchin might as well be a Republican at this rate. Thank God he's leaving the frickin' Senate. I am so sick of Joe Manchin. He needs to be in a retirement home on minimum wage. On absolute minimum wage. Let him make $7.25 an hour and cry like the rest of us do. The resolution must pass both houses of Congress and be signed by President Joe Biden, and that's not going to happen. Biden's not going to sign it. Biden hasn't said whether he supports the new joint employer rule, but he has cast himself as the most pro-union president in history. The new rule is scheduled to go into effect December 26th. And I'm going to tell you what, he better let it go through or he's going to lose. And you'll have Donald Trump back in office, and then you can really hurt. I'm sorry, union people are fed up with this. They want results. They are either going to see results or they're not going to vote. It's that simple. It really is, folks. 54-year-old Richard Eicher has worked in fast food for 25 years and now works at a McDonald's in Kansas City, Missouri. He said McDonald's clearly controls its franchise stores and is sidestepping its responsibilities to workers. Eicher, a leader in the pro-union group Stand Up KC, said unionizing can improve his pay, benefits, and working conditions. Eicher has foot pain and high blood pressure, but said his job doesn't offer affordable health care or paid time off to see a doctor. He often cuts his prescription medications in half because he can't afford to refill them. He said, quote, "McDonald's made almost $15 billion in profits over the last 2 years. They can certainly afford to treat us better, and with a union, we can make them do right by us," end of quote. Yeah, you definitely have got that right. The new joint employer rule had its origins in the Obama administration. In 2015, the NLRB ruled that Browning Ferris Industries, a waste management company, should be considered the joint employer of contract workers who were sorting its recycling because it had authority over their working conditions. A federal appeals court upheld the NLRB's decision in 2018. But during the Trump administration, yes, the orange pig, the Republican-controlled labor board narrowed the definition of a joint employer. Under the 2020 rule, companies could be considered a joint employer only if they had substantial direct and immediate control over employment conditions. The latest rule, passed by a board now controlled by Democrats, more closely resembles the Browning-Ferris ruling from 2015. It says companies may be considered joint employers if they have the authority to control directly or indirectly at least one condition of employment. Conditions include wages and benefits, hours and scheduling, the assignment of duties, work rules, and hiring. The rule only applies to labor relations. The Department of Labor sets its own joint employment standards for issues like meeting minimum wage requirements. Still, the new rule could have a major impact. Local franchise owners employ more than 8 million people in the U.S., according to the International Franchise Association. Millions more work for subcontractors or temporary agencies. John Mata, who owns 32 Dunkin' locations in New Hampshire and Virginia, said franchisees must meet certain brand standards and use Dunkin' uniforms and signage. But beyond that, they want to run their businesses independently. Mata said, quote, "We don't want our corporate partners to be telling us you have to pay this much per hour. That's not why I came into this business. I wanted to make all those decisions by myself." End of quote. In other words, he wants to be as cheap as he can. That's just the way it is. He wants to make all the money and not have to pay out. Mata leads the Coalition of Franchisee Associations, which represents around 46,000 franchisees. He's worried the rule will prompt Dunkin' and other companies to stop working with franchisees and run stores themselves, so they won't be held responsible if a franchisee commits labor violations. Michael Kaufman, an attorney who represents companies in labor disputes, said the rule has other potential complications. If a business hires temporary workers through a contractor, but then asks the contractor to fire a temporary worker for harassing someone, the new rule might allow the temporary worker to bring unfair labor charges against the business, according to Kaufman. He said, quote, "The NLRB thinks they are holding more people accountable, but they're holding the wrong people accountable." End of quote. Really? Yeah, there you go, folks. Labor unions said the NLRB will consider such circumstances on a case-by-case basis, but the rule is still necessary to ensure all workers can negotiate wages and working conditions. In a letter sent this month to members of Congress, written by the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters Union, and the Service Employees International Union, it said in part, quote, "Workers' right to collectively bargain cannot be realized if the entity that has the power to change terms and conditions of employment is absent from the bargaining table." End of quote. There you go. Beautiful. And while we're talking about labor, let's get into our next topic.
Stop! Hammer time!
Uh-oh. It's hammer time. It's time to drop the hammer on the douchebag of the week. We have a former winner winning once again yet this week. Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma. I have this story. This is Mary Claire Jelonic writing for the Associated Press, dated November 14th out of Washington. A congressional hearing devolved into an angry confrontation between a senator and a witness Tuesday after Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma challenged Sean O'Brien, the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, to, quote, "stand your butt up," end of quote, and settle long-standing differences right there in the room. If you don't believe me, we have this audio. It runs almost 3 minutes. Take a listen to a sitting United States senator attacking a witness.
Now, let's talk about Mr. O'Brien himself, his behavior. As everybody knows, and it's here in the last time, him and I kind of had a back and forth. Appreciate your demeanor today. It's quite different. But after you left here, you got pretty excited about the keyboard. In fact, you tweeted at me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And let me read what the last one said. It said, "Greedy CEO who pretends like he's self-made." Sir, I wish he was in the truck with me when I was building my plumbing company. Myself and my wife was running the office because I sure remember working pretty hard and long hours. Pretends like he's self-made. What a clown. Fraud. Always has been, always will be. Quit the tough guy act in these Senate hearings. You know where to find me. Any place, any time, cowboy. Sir, this is a time, this is a place. If you want to run your mouth, we can be two consenting adults. We can finish it here.
Okay, that's fine. Perfect.
You want to do it now?
I'd love to do it right now.
Well, stand your butt up then.
You stand your butt up.
Oh, hold on.
Big guy.
Oh, stop it.
Is that your solution, everybody?
No, sit down. No, you're a clown. Sit down.
Look at you.
You know, you're a United States Senator. Sit down.
Active.
Oh, okay.
Sit down, please.
All right.
Can I respond? Mr.
Hold
Chairman?
it. Hold it. If
Hold
we
on.
can, no,
This is
I have
what
the
he
mic.
said.
I'm sorry.
This is
Hold
what
it.
he said.
You'll have your time.
Okay.
Can I respond?
Oh, no, you can't. This is a hearing. And God knows the American people have enough of contempt for Congress. Let's not
I don't
make
like
it worse.
thugs and bullies.
And that's
I don't like you because you
Hold
just
it.
described yourself.
Hold it. You have the mic.
Yeah.
You have time.
All right.
Make your statement.
Then let's do this, because I did challenge you, and I accepted your challenge, and you went quiet.
No, I didn't go quiet.
Hold on.
No,
You challenged me to a cage match,
No,
acting like a
sir.
12-year-old schoolyard
Hold
bully.
it. Excuse
Sir,
me.
hold on.
Hold it. No, excuse me. I have the
I
mic.
will say exactly.
Senator
what you
Mullin,
said.
I have the mic. You have questions on any economic issues, anything that said, go for it. We're not here to talk about physical abuse.
You brought.
We're not
him
talking
in.
about. Of course, I
And,
did.
and let me
He's-
let me show you his hearing, because I want to expose this thug to who he is. And
Could you not point at me? That's disrespectful.
All right.
I don't care about respecting you at all. I respect
don't
people that
respect you at all.
respect. So
All right, hold it.
let me
Hold it. No.
You're one of
Yeah,
the,
hold it.
the most
Hold
elite
it,
people.
please.
Act it.
Please. All right. This is excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
This is a hearing to discuss economic issues. All right. If you have questions for Mr. O'Brien or anybody else on what he has said, go for it.
I mean-
But we're not here to talk about fights or anything else.
I'm quoting exactly what he said.
You can
and
say
this
what
is-
you want,
This is
but-
your witness
This
you
is
brought.
my
And let me.
witness.
I'm exposing him.
You can
as a
talk
person
anything
who
you
he
want,
is. So
but
in
no fight-
2013.
Bernie having to scold a sitting fellow U.S. Senator and a witness. It's like Uncle Bernie having to tell the children to calm down. I love it. I bet Bernie never expected to have to do that in his 40 years in Congress. Wow. The two men never came face to face in the hearing room, but they hurled insults at each other for around 6 minutes as Sanders repeatedly banged his gavel and tried to cut them off. Sanders, a longtime union ally, pleaded with them to focus on the economic issues that were the focus of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee hearing, which Sanders was holding to review how unions help working families. And why Mullin is a part of this committee is unknown. I really don't know why such a scab lover like Markwayne Mullin would be there. Oh my gosh. Skipping down in the article quite a bit. Asked later about the skirmish, Senate Republican Minority Leader Mitch McConnell demurred this. He said, quote, "It's very difficult to control the behavior of everybody who is in the building. I don't view that as my responsibility." End of quote. Of course not. None of that's his responsibility. Oh my gosh. Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota said that references were made to the back and forth in a GOP conference meeting after the hearing, but he said that no one should take it too seriously. Cramer said of the Senate, quote, "It's a dynamic place. We don't wear the white wigs anymore." End of quote. Talking about the powdered wigs that they used to wear. Oh my gosh. Unbelievable. So to Markwayne Mullin, we have this message for you.
Don't be a douchebag.
Yeah, that's right. You can't help it, Mark. You really can't. I don't care about your MMA record being 5-0. It could be 500-0. And I'm still going to put $20 down on O'Brien because he'll kick your ass. Punk. Unbelievable. But that's Republicans for you. Their only language that they understand is violence. That's all they understand. They don't understand anything else but violence. All right, so speaking of Congress averted another government shutdown. I have this story. This is Lisa Mascaro and Stephen Groves writing for the Associated Press. This is dated November 14th out of Washington. The House voted overwhelmingly Tuesday to prevent a government shutdown after new Republican Speaker Mike Johnson was forced to reach across the aisle to Democrats when hard-right conservatives revolted against his plan. Johnson's proposal to temporarily fund the government into the new year passed on a bipartisan 336 to 95 tally, but 93 Republicans voted against it. It was the first time the new speaker had to force vital legislation through the House, and he showed a willingness to leave his right-flank Republicans behind. The same political move that cost the last House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, his job just weeks ago. For now, Johnson of Louisiana appeared on track for a better outcome. His approach, which the Senate is expected to approve by week's end, effectively pushes a final showdown over government funding to the new year. At a news conference at the Capitol, Johnson said earlier Tuesday, quote, "Making sure that government stays in operation is a matter of conscience for all of us. We owe that to the American people," end of quote. Yeah, you damn right you do. The new Republican leader faced the same political problem that led to McCarthy's ouster. Angry, frustrated, hard-right GOP lawmakers rejected his approach, demanded budget cuts, and voted against the plan. Rather than the applause and handshakes that usually follow passage of a bill, several hardline conservatives animatedly confronted the speaker as they exited the chamber. Yeah, I wonder how many times he was told that he was number one. And not the index finger, the middle finger. Yeah. Without enough support from his Republican majority, Johnson had little choice but to rely on Democrats to ensure passage to keep the federal government running. Johnson's proposal puts forward a unique, critics say bizarre, two-part process that temporarily funds some federal agencies to January 19th and others to February 2nd. It's a continuing resolution, or CR, that comes without any of the deep cuts conservatives have demanded all year. It also fails to include President Joe Biden's request for nearly $106 billion for Ukraine, Israel, border security, and other supplemental funds. Vowing he would not support another stopgap, Johnson assured after a closed-door meeting of House Republicans Tuesday morning, quote, "We're not surrendering, but you have to choose fights you can win," end of quote. Yeah, you're going to lose. You're going to lose. You're going to lose. You stink. You're going to... Yeah. Stillwell Angel from the League of Their Own. Got him! Yeah. Johnson, who announced his endorsement Tuesday of Donald Trump as the Republican nominee for president, hit the airwaves to sell his approach and met privately Monday night with the Conservative Freedom Caucus. Oh, brother. Yeah, the Freedom Caucus. They want to strip you of your freedoms. Johnson says the innovative approach would position House Republicans to go into the fight for deeper spending cuts in the new year, but many Republicans are skeptical there will be any better outcome in January. Representative Chip Roy, a Texas Republican who is part of the House Freedom Caucus, did not hold back his opinion of the stopgap bill, saying, quote, "It's crap," end of quote. He said he would give a little bit of room to Johnson, who is 3 weeks into the job of Speaker. But Roy threatened to seize control of the House floor if conservative demands for cuts are not met in the months ahead. The opposition from hardline conservatives left Johnson with few other options than to skip what's typically a party-only procedural vote and rely on another process that requires a two-thirds tally with Democrats for passage. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries said Democrats were willing to find common ground with Republicans, quote, while pushing back against Republican extremism whenever necessary, end of quote. I bet Hakeem Jeffries is just absolutely loving this. In a statement with the other top Democratic leaders, Jeffries pointed out that a federal shutdown, quote, would hurt the economy, our national security, and everyday Americans, end of quote. He had noted in a letter to colleagues that the Republican package met Democratic demands to keep funding at current levels without steep reductions or divisive Republican policy priorities. Winning bipartisan approval of a continuing resolution is the same move that led McCarthy's hard right flank to oust him in October, days after the September 30th vote to avert a federal shutdown. For now, Johnson appears to be benefiting from a political honeymoon in one of his first big tests on the job. Representative Drew Ferguson, Republican of Georgia, said, quote, look, we're going to trust the Speaker's move here, end of quote. But Representative Marjorie Trader Greene, Republican of Georgia, McCarthy ally who opposed his ouster, said Johnson should be held to the same standard. Quote, what's the point in throwing out one speaker if nothing changes? The only way to make sure that real changes happen is make the red line stay the same for every speaker. End of quote. I love it when the Republicans violate the 11th commandment. Oh, this is great. The Senate, where Democrats have a slim majority, has signaled its willingness to accept Johnson's package ahead of Friday's deadline to fund the government. Oh, God. I'll leave the jokes to the amateur comics out there in the audience. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, called the House package a solution and said he expected it to pass Congress with bipartisan support. He said, quote, "It's nice to see us working together to avoid a government shutdown." End of quote. Yeah, I'm doing my McConnell impersonation. Bug eyes, pursed lips. McConnell doesn't have any lips. He's like a chicken. He doesn't have lips. But McConnell, the Republican of Kentucky, has noted that Congress still has work to do toward Biden's request to provide military aid, that is, U.S. military aid, for Ukraine and Israel and for other needs. Senators are trying to devise a separate package to fund U.S. supplies for the overseas wars and to bolster border security, but it remains a work in progress. If approved, passage of the continuing resolution would be a less than triumphant capstone to the House Republicans' first year in the majority. The Republicans have worked tirelessly to cut federal government spending, only to find their own Republican colleagues unwilling to go along with the most conservative priorities. Two of the Republican bills collapsed last week as moderates revolted. Instead, the Republicans are left funding the government essentially on autopilot at the levels that were set in bipartisan fashion at the end of 2022, when Democrats had control of Congress, but the two parties came together to agree on budget terms. All that could change in the new year when 1% cuts across the board to all departments would be triggered if Congress failed to agree to new budget terms and pass the traditional appropriations bills to fund the government by springtime. The 1% automatic cuts, which would take hold in April, are despised by all sides. Republicans say they are not enough. Democrats say they are too steep, and many lawmakers prefer to boost defense funds. But they are part of the debt deal McCarthy and Biden struck earlier this year. The idea was to push Congress to do better. The Take a look at Markwayne Mullin and his act toward Sean O'Brien. That's better. Unbelievable. The legislation also extends Farm Bill programs through September, the end of the current fiscal year. That addition was an important win for some farm state lawmakers. Representative Mark Pocan, Democrat of Wisconsin, for example, warned that without the extension, milk prices would have soared and hurt producers back in his home state. He said, quote, "The Farm Bill extension was the biggest sweetener for me," end of quote. Well, I don't blame him. And right now, let's go ahead to an update on Ottawa County politics. We thought that we had a deal. We thought that there was going to be a resignation and Adeline Hambley would be paid out $4 million. But hold on. Plot twist. This is Mitchell Boltman writing for the Holland Sentinel. This is dated November 14th. The Ottawa County Board of Commissioners again recessed from a special meeting meant to signal the end of a termination hearing for Health Officer Adeline Hambley that began in October. The board met at 9 a.m. Tuesday, November 14th for the fifth session of the meeting, which began October 24th. Commissioners immediately entered closed session upon reconvening, where they met for more than 6.5 hours. The board returned to open session at 3:45 p.m., at which time Board Chair Joe Moss motioned for a recess until 1:30 p.m. November 28th. The board also postponed a regularly scheduled meeting meant to be held after the conclusion of the hearing Tuesday. That meeting will now be held Tuesday, November 21st. Commissioners voted last week to accept a settlement recommendation from corporate counsel in Hambley's case following an 8-hour closed session. They were expected to formalize that agreement Tuesday, but no such vote occurred. The Holland Sentinel reported last week that Ottawa County agreed to pay Hambley a total of $4 million to step down, the largest settlement in the county's history and nearly the exact amount the board cut from the Public Health Department's budget this year. Under that agreement, Deputy Health Officer Marcia Mansoray would also resign after being placed on paid administrative leave through the end of January. She'd then receive 1 year's pay at $125,000 plus the benefits she currently receives. The board's OI majority voted to accept the settlement recommendation, while 3 non-OI commissioners, Doug Zylstra, Roger Bergman, and Jacob Bonema, voted no. Commissioner Kyle Terpstra left before the vote. Hambley and the board's OI majority have been battling in court for months. The disagreement began when OI commissioners voted to demote Hambley from permanent health officer to interim health officer in January in favor of a candidate ideologically aligned with themselves. The initial termination hearing dates were October 24th and 25th and included witness testimony from current and former Ottawa County employees. It focused on a series of charges drafted by Moss alleging Hambley demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty during the budget development process. Following the latest meeting Tuesday, Hambley's attorney Sarah Riley Howard told reporters she felt a binding settlement was reached November 6th, but said the county felt otherwise. Howard said, quote, "Our position is we had a binding settlement agreement with known terms pending, and we were just reducing it to writing. There was some disagreement today about whether that was the case. We're continuing to have talks surrounding that issue and to see if we can resolve the situation with a settlement." End of quote. Howard said it remains possible a settlement isn't reached and the board proceeds with its vote to keep or terminate Hambley. She added, quote, "Either path is still possible at this point, I would say." End of quote. Howard said the negotiations have been quasi-typical in terms of process, but, quote, "It's just not typical you would do it in the middle of a public hearing context like this where everybody is waiting and nobody can see what's happening." End of quote. Hambley currently remains in her position as health officer for now. So there's that story. So we'll keep you updated. We'll see what happens in 2 weeks. In the meantime, some good news for Ottawa County voters. This is Sarah Leach of the Holland Sentinel writing November 14th out of Ottawa County. A recall effort targeting an Ottawa Impact-backed Ottawa County commissioner could soon be okayed for the May ballot after the group of citizens spearheading the effort announced that they had gathered enough valid signatures. On Tuesday, November 14th, the committee to recall Lucy Ebel announced it had 2,653 valid signatures verified with current voter registration records. It exceeds the 2,481 signatures required to put the matter on the spring ballot. That's down from more than 3,000 signatures the group turned in to recall Lucy Ebel, who represents the 2nd District. Ebel is a member of Ottawa Impact, which currently has a 6-member majority on the board. The far-right fundamentalist group was formed in 2021 over frustrations with the county and state over COVID-19 mitigation measures. Since taking office, Ebel and other Ottawa Impact-linked commissioners have pushed through a series of controversial decisions, including firing the previous county administrator and former corporation counsel, attempting to demote the county health officer, eliminating the county's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office, and making deep cuts to the health department's operating budget. Those decisions have resulted in at least 4 ongoing lawsuits against the commission and a 6-week investigation from Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel. The recall language for Ebel was submitted July 3rd, the first day commissioners were eligible for the procedure. The Ottawa County Election Commission ruled July 17th the wording for the recall petition was factual and of sufficient clarity to be certified for ballot. Ebel appealed that decision July 26th, but a circuit court judge rejected her argument on August 26th, allowing the 60-day signature gathering process to start. The recall effort had to submit a minimum of 2,480 signatures, 25% of the number of votes who cast a ballot in the most recent gubernatorial race in Ebel's district. Park Township resident Larry Jackson, the sponsor of the petition, said, quote, "The recall election will be a referendum on Ottawa Impact. The malicious actions of Lucy Ebel, Joe Moss, and the other Ottawa Impact commissioners continue to cause harm to the citizens of Ottawa County." End of quote. Jackson said recent cuts to the county's health department budget, mounting legal costs, and a lack of transparency inspired thousands of residents to sign the recall petition. Jackson said, quote, "Their attacks on the health department will not only harm the Ottawa County residents who are most in need of their help and compassion, but everyone who swims in our beaches, eats in our restaurants, or enjoys our many parks and festivals. They are eroding trust with both county employees and the general public." End of quote. Ebel now has 8 days to challenge any of the validated signatures, but the challenges, quote, "must be in writing and must be specific in nature," end of quote, about a voter's validity of registration or the genuineness of a signature. That is according to the clerk's office. If Ebel doesn't challenge any signatures, or if enough signatures are not invalidated by November 23rd, the special election will appear on the May 7th ballot in the 2nd District, which includes parts of Park Township and Holland Township. Ebel has never responded to the Holland Sentinel's request for comment. 2 other recall efforts are ongoing against Ottawa County commissioners. Duplicate petitions were filed September 1st against District 10 Commissioner Roger Bergman, a moderate Republican, and District 3 Commissioner Doug Zylstra, the board's lone Democrat. Bergman and Zylstra both appeared at a September 12th clarity hearing before the county's election commission, which ruled the language was sufficient to move forward. Zylstra appealed that decision September 20th, which prevented the signature gathering process from starting until a circuit court hearing or 40 days passed, whichever was sooner, according to state election law. But a hearing was never scheduled, so the signature process was allowed to proceed as of October 30th. It wasn't known as of publication time how the signature gathering effort is proceeding. If either process is successful, those recall elections would also take place on May 7th. So there's the latest update from Ottawa County, and I'm just going to really put it bluntly. I talked to a longtime listener of our show, a supporter of our show, and I'm going to mention a comment that he made the other day. Actually, he made it earlier today. Regarding Ottawa County, he said, quote, "The douchebags need an emergency manager, which they'd have if they were predominantly black." End of quote. Well, I responded to him and said that I would put somebody who would make the rebukes cry the loudest, maybe former Governor Jim Blanchard. So my friend replied, "The same as when Gladwin's drain commissioner racked up $11.2 billion in fines. Why don't white counties get emergency managers?" And my response was that the answer is in the question. And it's because that white communities never get emergency managers. They always target people of color. That's the way it's always been in this state. And that needs to change. I am imploring Governor Gretchen Whitmer to put an emergency manager in place in Ottawa County now. They obviously can't do the job. They're incapable of it. They don't have the mental faculties for it. The state needs to intervene right now before Ottawa County goes down the drain. That's it for this week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.